Hi, I'm Noam Maital, and welcome to the GovAI Podcast. AI is the most powerful technology of our time, and government still figuring out how to navigate this new frontier. Join me as we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming public service, unlocking potential efficiencies, the risks that no one's talking about, and what happens when innovation moves faster than regulation. And today, to talk on these exact topics, I'm joined by Chris McMasters, CIO of the city of Corona, California. Chris has been at the forefront of bringing practical innovation into local government, making Corona, which you could consider kind of a small, mid-sized city, a city that's on the map, not just kind of open to new technology, actively using it to improve residents' lives. We'll dive a bit into some of the stuff that he's done in the city to get there, and his approach to this practical innovation, and of course, how AI fits into Corona's strategy into all of this. And from there, of course, diving a bit into what it takes to keep the city ahead of the curve. So, Chris, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to join you.
So before we jump, I have so many questions for you around your AI strategy and your thoughts around AI. But before we dive knee deep into that, I'd like to actually take a step back and maybe tell us a bit about your background and how did you end up getting into government? Because I know you spent some time in the private sector as well.
Yeah, that's quite a story. I think, so I did 17, 18 years in the private sector as a CIO. Kind of worked my way up through the ranks. So did everything from networking to data analytics to coding, and then eventually sort of climbed the management ladder, through that organization until I got into, executive functions. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the chase. I enjoyed the focus that the private sector has. It was always entertaining. When government came along, I think I was a little bit concerned about going that route. You hear about all the stereotypes of how government functions, all the bureaucracy, and I believed that for a bit. I think the allure of government was that we could do something that was for the benefit of society versus, just the dollar and just the shareholder. And I kind of got into that point in my career where you see a lot of that. And so I felt like it was time to make a change and to try something different that was out of the box. Every CEO and CIO that I talked to told me not to do it. And I'm usually one of those abrasive people who's like, oh, no, okay, I'll go do that. And so I've jumped in, I drank the Kool-Aid. I learned a lot really fast. I had some really good mentors, some really good city managers and people who helped me understand how government functioned, and its relationship with the citizens it serves. And really, it came down to a conversation. I remember they said, if you really want to do good in this world, then there's no better place to be. And I found that to be true. And I found that there are, the people that work in government for the most part are very dedicated, service-oriented people, and they want to do right. And so it's been interesting leading teams like that, but also motivating teams like that, right? Because we're not motivated by return on investment. We're not motivated by some profit or revenue stream, right? We're literally motivated by how we serve individuals in the communities and trying to build them. So yeah, that was kind of my, in a nutshell, like how I got here. Sometimes there's days I question why I'm here, and other days no, but other days I know exactly why I'm here, right? I think that's kind of the magic of it. So never a dull day.
Yeah, and I'll test. Having known you for a while and seen inside the city kind of how things work. What's interesting about Corona is just not your innovative approach alone, but the fact that it's kind of trickled throughout the city, and that reflects itself in some kind of even survey data, looking at employees' approach to AI and technology. What's the secret sauce there, right? Because if you talk about, I'm coming from the private sector, building companies, selling it to government. Often one of the biggest challenges is you'll get a excited champion around a technology, but then a full load of headwind in the form of stakeholders that are sitting in positions that are complacent, we'll call it, in kind of the status quo. So how do you trickle down this kind of culture of innovation across the different departments and the city?
It's kind of two pieces of a puzzle. So I think the first one is you have to believe in what you're doing. You have to believe in that product. You have to believe in whatever that is. For me, I'm a curious person, so I like to see how things work. I like to ask lots of questions. I like to see how it might apply. Um, but the second part of that is, I think the trick that really good CIOs have is understanding their organizations, understanding the people. In government, for instance, um, since they're not chasing after dollars, a lot of times, right? Like there isn't this impetus to change. There's an impetus to stay the same, right? It's not like government workers get a bigger bonus if they are more efficient or if they're using the latest technology, right? They don't, there's no plus for them, except
Yep.
that maybe it makes their job a little easier, right? In some senses, but then they have to relearn that job, right? With the new technology. So they're prone to that. And I think as a CIO, you have to um, really market to a degree, but it's marketing with authenticity, of how it will help them. And then I do personally lots of pilots with people. So I like to go in and pilot to prove it out for them and so that they can see the benefits without doing a full investment or without IT forcing some application on them, right? I want them to want it, and see the good in it. And usually when that happens, when they know that IT is a real part of the organization or department, right? That we're actually supporting them. We're not supporting the vendor necessarily. We're supporting them, and we want them to be successful, and that we're their advocate, right? That culture changes. And so, when I first got in, I didn't have a lot of advocates, and I didn't have a lot of champions, and so I focused on building good relationships with people throughout the organization at every level. Um, and once I think you have that trust, then you can introduce technology right to that equation. Not that there isn't resistance, but
Yeah.
it makes it a lot easier when you have that trust and they know that you're there to try to help, especially when things are new and scary.
Well, as someone that's bringing in the innovation, I'm going to guess that you get inundated with vendors that approach you on a monthly basis. I mean, how many, just for the sake of listening, how many vendors approach you with emails on a monthly basis, would you say?
Somewhere probably between 30 and 50. I get inundated. My email box is insane.
So I'm curious here, right? Because that is you'll hear that often, right? And that can be overwhelming. I'd imagine I'd be overwhelmed by that. So, but I'm curious, how do you sift through that noise and perhaps, even putting the hat of advising, if you will, these startups, perhaps listeners here that are aspiring to build companies in the GovTech space around AI, what is the right approach to get your attention and effectively engage?
So the first thing is just understanding what our problems are. So I'm definitely, if you cold call me and you don't know what our issues are or what we might be tackling or have an understanding of Corona, right? Um, you're probably going to be put out further than the other guys that do. Usually for me when I'm going through vendors, it's either looking at problem or looking at applications or solutions that solve immediate needs that we have, or it's on our roadmap. So when we're looking at IT, the way I always look at like the role of CIOs and organizations is we almost have to second guess what's coming, right? What the organization is going to demand. So my job is to be two steps ahead of whatever the city wants, right? So that when they want it, I can deliver it right immediately, and it's not a buildup to it.
Mhm.
So a lot for us is how we roadmap and what we're looking at. So even in the terms of like we take AI, right? We've been dabbling with generative AI and forms of AI for several years now. Then it sort of became mainstream. But the good part is, in our part of the organization, we already had some advanced knowledge of it. We were already using it to certain extents, and experimenting. So, which I don't think happens a lot in government. So this is kind of, I guess, a differentiator, right? In the private sector, I had research and development budgets, and so we're buying tech because I'm competing against the guy next door, right? And I have to win that for our company to stay in business. So we're always trying to leverage technology, almost weaponize it to a degree, right, to remain ahead. Government's a little bit different in that case, but there are similarities in trying to think ahead of what the organization needs and plotting that course out.
You kind of jumped into the open door. That was my next question. Walk me through, as you're looking at this more from a national perspective, why do you think government, and there's some obvious reasons here, but I think some that aren't potentially for listeners, why is the public sector kind of the last frontier around AI in terms of we're seeing maturity of adoption or scale, and what are some of the biggest challenges that you think are still in front of us?
I think generally government is a slow follower, even if you could call it that. Government, number one, is risk averse. So it's how do we not end up on TV or the news? How do we not make sure your water's clean and no one gets hurt? How do we make sure when you dial 911 someone appears, right? But outside of that, like, cities, it's not about revenue. It's not about any of those things. It's about, the risk aversion. How do we mitigate risk through the organization, right? And that's why you see government, they have huge bureaucracies that focus around procedure versus outcome. And so I think that's the first lesson, at least for me, because in the private sector, it's about outcome, how fast I can get that outcome, right? And so you drive towards that. But in government, you can have a horrible outcome, but a perfect process, and they'll probably applaud, right? It's like going to the DMV and you're like,
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, I think that's a core differentiator, and how things sort of function. But in the sense of AI, what's interesting to me is, of all the organizations, types of organizations that are out there, government is actually very primed for it. They have the most data. They have more data than anyone, right? I mean, we have terabytes of data that just sits out there, that we collect. And so usually in organizations, that's what they lack, right? They're trying to collect data to build models, or they're trying to, create RAG or whatever, on top of that, where government actually has a lot of that. It's just that government is extremely cautious, like when they walk in. And I've seen that with private sector too. There's a lot of private sector companies who are sort of, have internal contention between their legal teams, right? And then the vendors and the IT teams, right, that are behind it. I think that government usually walks with policy first. And I think that's also the inhibitor of government from being really innovative in a lot of spaces. And I think when you look at things like the advent of social media, government kind of closed its eyes to say, well, it's going to go away. We don't have to deal with that. Just don't use it. No one should use it, right? And so they built all these policies around how no government employee could use social media at the time, right? That's obviously changed, right? And government's embraced it, but it took years for that to happen. AI is kind of in that similar state, of all the organizations that I've had the opportunity to be a part of that help design policies. Those policies are fairly restrictive, by measure, to the point where it doesn't allow creativity or innovation, within the organization, and people then become afraid to use it because it's so burdened with those types of policies. So I think in that case, we're different.
I mean, you're spot on. I'm obviously a bit biased on my assessment here, but if you were to describe the best characteristics today of where Gen AI is in its maturity, maybe in 5 years somewhere else, it would be in repetitive, text-rich, bureaucratic environment. And if we were playing charades, and I would ask you, what industry I'm talking about, you would likely guess GovTech. So one of the things, though, that then you talked about is that policy side of it and the risk. And that's inherent in AI. There's a few challenges here. One is the vendor. The other is user behavior with the tool itself, which is a little bit different than your traditional software environment. So what is the right approach to managing the risk as you're thinking about it from Corona's perspective? And how do you balance that a bit with what you talked about of not impeding on the creativity and the innovation that comes with, not having a burdensome regulatory environment?
So I think recognizing out of the gate, for most government agencies, PRA requests, requests from the public for information, they pretty much can request anything. Yeah. So we have to be transparent, just by the law. So given that sort of those parameters, right? There's really nothing, you can ask for my emails, you can ask for my texts, you can ask for documents that are completed. You can, right? You can ask for a lot of things from government and they have to produce those documents for you. So there isn't a whole lot of privacy except when it comes to personal identifiable information, right? Which we do restrict. So really we focus on that, keeping that layer out. And even in PRA requests, right? That's something we do. We strike a lot of that type of information. I always say that data doesn't always have the same level of security because it doesn't have the same amounts of value, right? So that type of information, we definitely wrap our arms around it, and we don't want that to exit the organization by any means. But a lot of the data, we don't care. It's all public information, so they can, I think, looking at AI policy, at least from my perspective, is one, they're already using it. Your employees are using it, whether you want to admit that or not. And if they're not using it at work, they're definitely using it at home. And if they're not using it on their workstation, they're using it on their phone. Right? The cat's out of the bag. This is already sort of proceeding through organizations. And so I think the idea is, for me at least, is like, instead of starting out with restrictive policy, why don't we start out first trying to understand what people are doing and how they're doing it within your organization. See if there are sort of valuable, propositions throughout your organization that could be leveraged across the organization. What tools are they using, right? So instead of trying to drop the hammer on everyone for using it, let's first explore what they're doing, and maybe it's great, right? Because usually your people doing that, they are being innovative, right? They are trying to make their jobs easier, and so why don't we, right, as a government, try to look at it that way first before we tack down all the rules. So that's my kind of proposition, that we do that. We take that, we find out how people are using it. We look at risk factors with things that they are using, right, before we start placing restrictions on things. And then we slowly tighten down the organization. Now, through that process, right, there still has to be an understanding of what PII is, right? And in a general sense, most government employees already know that. Mm-hmm. So it's not a very hard discussion, but I think the challenge then becomes, how do you allow employees to innovate and use the technology without having to go through like a 15-page document that outlines how they're supposed to use it, and for them to remember that, all the rules and regulations that are associated with that for your particular organization. And how do you centralize control?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that cities have going for them that's unique, when you have a transformative technology, it's going to embed itself first from the day-to-day life of everyone. And so we saw this when Google came out with search and Google Maps and internet, right? You didn't have a question if your employees were using Google Maps in their personal life. It just was happening.
Yeah.
And so you knew very quickly that kind of GIS-based applications were coming in as well. Same thing's happening now. People are using ChatGPT to, summarize their emails. It's just a question of, is it going to be authorized or not? So one side that I want to dive with you is around this concept or risk of AI replacing the human, or being so efficient that we need less to do the same or more. And I'm curious how you see that thesis, and whether you've encountered that across your city, or employees that raise that as a concern of, well, you're going to deploy this new system, it will replace my job.
Yeah. And I think I think there's a large portion of the populace that depends on government jobs. I think it's a legitimate concern, for people. And I guess my answer to it is, one, we're just getting started. Like, there's lots of change, lots of things are evolving. But really, two, at least as long as I've been in government for the last 10 years, I don't think there's any end to the demands of what your citizens want, which means you will always have a job, because what you can't even imagine the things that they're going to want next, right? As we become more efficient. So I see AI more as a companion. to people and helping people, both on externally to citizens, but also to staff, and it augments kind of their abilities to do their job and do it faster and more accurately, more efficiently and more innovatively. But I really just don't see an end to what people want, right? It's like you satisfy one thing and then they want another thing. And I think that's going to just keep on going, as we go along. So I don't think there's a whole lot to worry about actually in that. Now, menial tasks, yeah, that's going to change, right? Things we can automate workflows and make it more efficient for people. Absolutely, right? We'll be able to get information quicker and more accurately and analyze large volumes of data more accurately, right? And automate kind of back-end processes, of course. And I think my goal has always been with technology is to say, what makes organizations special are their people, right? It's your big brain. Like that's what I really want at the end of the day. So if I as a technologist can help shed the mundane stuff of what you do, then I get closer to utilizing what is the best thing about you, which is your brain, right? That you're creative and you're an individual, you see things differently. So if technology can allow us to do that, we actually get more from our employees and they are more engaged and they feel like that their value has increased. So that's how I view AI.
It's interesting because I often describe where we are with AI and AI as a tool for governments as kind of an all around B plus player, meaning
Yeah.
it does things pretty good across a really wide variety of things. But if you want A plus execution or outcome, that is where what you called the brains, the experience, the expertise, the local knowledge of the community, all the stuff that you actually pay the salaries for the employees that they have the experience for, where it comes in. And so it's more of an accelerant for the work. And like you said, removing this big layer of bureaucracy, documentation, processes that can be streamlined. But one of the keys to unlocking that is the ability to train and give the education and knowledge for these employees and how to use these AI tools, because it's a different, I know for myself, I had a learning curve of engaging early on with kind of ChatGPT and the early models as a companion, right? And initially expecting magic results coming out, learning prompt engineering, understanding which models work better for what. How do you think we approach this challenge, especially, and if I'm stereotyping a bit here, that in government, sometimes you have the kind of less tech savvy oriented folks, not across the board, but you do kind of find some of that within the government space.
I think with the people that I don't want to call them Luddites, but they're just technology averse, or that they get to a certain technology and they sort of stick in that one place. And I can't say that I'm not that way sometimes, right? There's certain things that you get attached to, you like that tech, and then someone comes up with something new, and you're like, I'll wait, and you're not as willing to try something out sometimes. I have to force myself to do that sometimes, or I have people in my organization who poke me enough, and I'm like, okay, I'll go try it, and I'll spend some time kind of learning something. I think what it comes down to, though, for most people is, you know, is it just hype, or will it actually have an impact on me? Like, will it really change something like this, whatever this is, right? Is it just a bright, shiny thing that we're chasing, or will this have meaning to the things that I do? And so, again, it goes back to this idea of piloting and demonstrating and working with them, knowing them well enough to know where their sort of constraints are, where they're having a hard time, and then being able to offer solutions to them, right, that actually have impact and meaning to what they do. So, and a lot of times that isn't bright and shiny things. It's not about, that the AI can do some complex algorithm and whatever. And sometimes it's just very simple things like uh, scheduling calendars, or synchronize. Like, it can be very simple things that have huge impacts. Taking notes, transcribing, right, and summarizing meetings. Um, that can be very tedious. But for that person doing it, when you introduce them to AI, suddenly they go, I want that. I don't know what AI is, but I want whatever you just did. Right?
I want you to save me that 10 hours that I've been doing that
Yeah.
weekly.
No, we have a city manager has a secretary who I just introduced actually to doing transcribing and summarization and taking out action items. And when she saw how AI did it, I mean, literally the next meeting, she's like, "Can you turn that on, please?" And send me. She really wanted it so badly. But see that, and so to me, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. So for there's the people in government that are kind of slow movers, it's really demonstrating at a very base level, like this is how it impacts, right? And I think that at the beginning of AI, there was a lot of hype around it because people, they'd ask it a question. Oh, look, it was sort of a novelty, right? Let's see if it can answer right. They were testing it.
Write me a story like Shakespeare, right? All these
Yeah,
gimmicky
they
stuff.
do all these things, right? And I think so. It was almost like people were searching, like, well, how do I use this correct? Like, how do I help? How can it help me in actuality? And so I think that's where both vendors and technologists on both sides, right? It's really rewriting how work is done and showing people, right, how it will impact and how it will continue to impact, right, the course of their careers. So
I want to end on two questions. We'll ask about the past and then the future, because we talk a lot about the present and the future around AI. But I'm curious from your vantage point right now as kind of a CEO of Corona, having been there for several years, if you were to go back, let's say we'll say 5 years, what advice would you give to yourself kind of around this topic of AI? What would you have maybe done a bit differently?
we focused a lot when I first got into government. Uh, there was really not a lot of analytics at the time. So, which was what was kind of shocking to me, because from the private sector a decade ago, 2 decades ago, right? We were running dashboards and predictive analytics and everything from how we did logistics to how we produce products to how we monitor social interactions, right? All of my executives, right at that level, they depend on those. Like they would literally pop their phone open in the morning, check their dashboard, see what direction, and make changes as they went on. When I got in government, the first thing that my CEO at that time said is, "I'm blind. I need your help. Like I need to understand what's going on because everything for me, I get reported to 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
So how do I get ahead of that process, right? How do we become data driven?" And so we did. We focused on that, right? We built dashboards. We built all these predictive analytics at the beginning of like when I started to give him vision. But around that, right, is governance. And I think when it comes to AI, that's the most critical component of all of it. If you do not have good governance over your data, you don't know who the owners are, what pots everything lies in, and how the AI is going to interact with that. That can be a very big headache, And so we did spend some time on that. I think when we started introducing AI, more largely in the organization, we found out very quickly, like we have to get anything that's we don't understand on the data side. We need to understand that. We need to wrap our arms around that, because AI can get confused too, right? Or it can have overreach, or it can, hallucinate for certain things. And so there's ways that you can mitigate those things if you understand the data side of the house, right, and the governance behind that data.
So, with that in mind, if you were to look now 10 years forward, where do you think Corona will be?
Ooh, like I don't want to say Terminator because I don't believe that.
Well, if you read yesterday, Thomas Friedman posted an article in the New York Times around how AGI, general artificial intelligence, is coming our way. I think a little not overhyped, but his timeline's a bit too short. But yeah, some people do believe we're entering that era as well.
There was a comment about, between, I don't want to say it was like Mark Zuckerberg and a few other people got together and they basically were making bets on when would the first billion-dollar company happen that was run by one person, right? And the rest of it would be run by agents, AI agents in the background, right? AI that did your marketing, AI that did your finance, right? All that stuff. And currently, right, that's slowly what's happening, right? You see that in Google and other places where there are the more mundane tasks, they're creating agents to do coding, agents to review coding, agents to, right, as it goes along. I think that government in some form or fashion will be similar, right? There'll be lots of government agents, right? Government agents that help you make meetings and appointments, government agents that tell you when the library is open, government agents that tell you, that you can interact with, right, to pick up your trash, right? I think there's going to be a lot of agents and people that will drive those agents. Sometimes people over agents, sometimes people answering to agents, right? On the
Yeah.
other side, right? It'll be a very different organization, but that I still think it will be very people centric. It'll be very human centric in how we do things, right? Because that humanity is not part of the agents, and so there has to be a guide and a vision like to all of that. But what do I see for people that live in Corona in 15 years? A much more less bureaucratic heavy, efficient agency that delivers services on demand. That government doesn't have to stop at 6 p.m. Right?
Yeah.
We could have agents intaking, making decisions for us, putting it in front of us to allow the human, right, to check off. But that, if you want to get a building permit done, you don't have to take off work on Tuesday and when City Hall's open and go stand in a line anymore, right? That all of that is taken care of. And so that's what I see, is that what people demand today, sort of out of the Amazons of the world, I think you'll find a government that's much more responsive, that's more accurate, right, and can serve a multitude more of people, right, in how we do things. So
I think we're all saying amen to that. So hopefully that vision comes true. And we'll check. We'll have to come back in 10 years and either check with you or with your agent whether whether that ends up becoming true. But thank you, Chris. This was a fascinating discussion. I think there's a lot to learn from this, both for listeners that are from the private sector side, aspiring to kind of come into the GovTech, and also for other leaders in the CIO and city space to glean some of the secret sauce of how you take a city like Corona and make it innovative. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
That's it for this episode of the GovAI Podcast. AI is reshaping governance in real time, and as we've seen, the path forward is filled with both promise and complexity. But conversations like this, open, challenging, forward-thinking, are how we shape a smarter, more responsible future. The GovAI Podcast is produced by Poldu, our editor is Noam Maital, with production assistance from Shani Ra and Shakel Dro. We'll be back in 2 weeks to tackle more challenges and explore creative solutions at the intersection of AI and the public sector. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and never forget that even the sharpest tools mean nothing without the hand that wields them.